The air crackled with tension that humid summer afternoon, thick as the Georgia heat pressing down on the town square. A single act of kindness had sparked a firestorm, and now, in the shadow of ancient oaks, a wedding was unraveling before it even began. At the heart of it stood Grace, a black homeless woman whose presence at a white couple's wedding had ignited a fury no one saw coming. Grace had been invisible for years, a ghost drifting through the small town of Willow Creek. Her tattered coat and weathered backpack were as much a part of the scenery as the cracked sidewalks. She'd learned to keep her head down, to avoid the stares, the whispers, the occasional cruelty hurled her way. But today, she wasn't invisible. Today, she stood at the center of a storm, her dark eyes blazing with a quiet strength that made the crowd uneasy. It started with a simple gesture. Emily, the bride-to-be, had seen Grace sitting on a bench outside the church, her hands cupped around a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. Emily, with her soft blue eyes and a heart too big for Willow Creek's narrow boundaries, had approached her. "Would you like to come to my wedding?" she'd asked, her voice trembling with sincerity. It was a small act, impulsive, born of a belief that love could bridge any divide. Grace, stunned, had nodded, clutching the invitation like it was a lifeline. Now, hours later, the church lawn buzzed with chaos. Emily's fiancé, Nathan, stood red-faced, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This is our day, Emily. You invited her. A homeless woman. Do you know what people are saying?" His words dripped with a venom Grace knew too well, the kind that came from fear dressed up as pride. The crowd, family, friends, and curious onlookers formed a loose circle, their murmurs a low hum of judgment. Emily's face crumpled, but she held her ground, her white dress glowing under the midday sun. "She's a person, Nathan. She deserves to be here as much as anyone." Her voice shook, but there was steel beneath it. Grace, standing a few feet away, felt the weight of every eye on her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the cracks of the earth. But something in Emily's defiance sparked a fire in her chest. She straightened, her calloused hands tightening around her backpack straps. "You don't get it, do you?" Nathan snapped, turning his glare on Grace. "This isn't about you being a person. It's about respect. This is a private event, not a charity case." His words landed like a slap, and a gasp rippled through the crowd. A few nodded in agreement, their faces tight with discomfort. Others looked away, ashamed but silent. Grace's heart pounded, but she met Nathan's eyes. She'd faced worse than this, cops rousing her from park benches, shopkeepers shooing her away, the endless sting of being less than human in their eyes. "I didn't ask to be here," she said, her voice low but steady. "But I'm not leaving. Not when someone showed me kindness for the first time in years." The crowd fell silent. Emily's eyes glistened with tears, but she stepped closer to Grace, her hand brushing against the older woman's arm. "You're staying," she said firmly, her gaze locked on Nathan. "If you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Nathan's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. For a moment, it seemed he might explode, but the weight of Emily's words hung heavy in the air. The crowd shifted, some whispering, others staring in stunned silence. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. It was about who belonged, who mattered, and what it meant to stand up when the world demanded you stay down. Grace had never planned to be a symbol. She'd spent her life surviving, not fighting. Born in a town not unlike Willow Creek, she'd once had a job, a home, a family. But life had a way of unraveling. A layoff, a bad breakup, medical bills that piled up like bricks slipped through the cracks until the streets became her home. The world had taught her she was nothing, and most days, she believed it. But Emily's invitation had cracked something open inside her, a flicker of worth she thought she'd lost. The confrontation escalated as Nathan's mother, Clara, pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of indignation. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her pearls glinting as she pointed at Grace. "You're embarrassing us, Emily. You think you're being noble, but you're making a mockery of this family." Her words were sharp, but there was fear in her eyes, fear of what Grace represented, fear of a world where lines of class and color blurred. Emily's voice rose, trembling but fierce. "If our family can't welcome someone in need, then what are we even celebrating?" She turned to Grace, her eyes pleading. "Please, stay. I want you here." Grace felt the weight of the moment, the eyes boring into her, the unspoken rules of Willow Creek pressing down. She could walk away, fade back into invisibility. It would be easier. Safer. But something in Emily's gaze, raw, desperate hope held her in place. She thought of her own mother, long gone, who taught her to stand tall even when the world tried to break her. "I'll stay," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a vow. Nathan threw up his hands, pacing in a tight circle. "Fine. Let her stay. Let everyone see what a circus this wedding's become." He stormed toward the church, leaving Emily and Grace in the center of the crowd's scrutiny. Clara followed him, muttering about disgrace, while the onlookers whispered among themselves, some with pity, others with scorn. Emily took a shaky breath, turning to Grace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know it would turn into this." Grace managed a small smile, her eyes soft but unyielding. "You gave me a seat at the table. That's more than most." She paused, her voice dropping. "Don't let him make you feel small." The words hit Emily like a wave, and for a moment, the two women stood together, an island in a sea of judgment. The crowd began to disperse, some heading into the church, others lingering, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. The wedding was still hours away, but the air felt heavier, charged with questions no one dared voice aloud. Inside the church, Nathan sat in a pew, his head in his hands. He wasn't a bad man, not really. He'd grown up in Willow Creek, steeped in its traditions, its unspoken rules. He loved Emily, but her idealism clashed with his need for control, for things to make sense. Grace's presence felt like a challenge to everything he'd been taught about status, about propriety, about who belonged where. He didn't hate her, he feared what she represented, a crack in the foundation of his world. Emily found him there, her dress trailing behind her like a ghost. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady now. "This isn't just about Grace. It's about us. About who we're going to be." Nathan looked up, his eyes tired. "I just wanted today to be perfect," he said, almost pleading. "Is that so wrong?" "Perfect for who?" Emily asked. "For you. For your family. Or for what's right?" She sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. "I love you, Nathan, but I can't marry someone who'd turn away a person just because they're different." Her words stung, and Nathan felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd always seen himself as fair, as good. But the truth was harder to face. He thought of his father, a man who'd never questioned the way things were, who'd taught him to keep the world neatly divided. For the first time, Nathan wondered if he'd inherited more than just his father's name. Outside, Grace sat on the bench where Emily had first found her, the invitation still clutched in her hand. She didn't know if she'd stay for the ceremony. Part of her wanted to run, to spare Emily the trouble. But another part, the part that had survived years of rejection, of hunger, of being unseen, refused to back down. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed the world could be kind. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the square, the church doors opened, and Emily stepped out, her face resolute. She walked straight to Grace, ignoring the stares. "I meant what I said," she told her. "You're part of this day. And I'm not letting anyone take that away." Grace looked at her, seeing not just a bride but a woman choosing to stand for something bigger than herself. "You're braver than you know," Grace said softly. "But you're gonna need that courage. This town doesn't forget." Emily nodded, her eyes fierce. "Then let them remember this. The wedding was still hours away, but the real ceremony had already begun, a collision of hearts and histories, of prejudice and redemption, playing out under the watchful eyes of Willow Creek. What happened next would ripple far beyond the church, beyond the town, into the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The church was a battlefield of whispers as the wedding hour approached. The pews filled with guests in their Sunday best, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Grace sat in the back, her worn backpack tucked under the seat, her presence a silent challenge to the town's rigid order. Emily had insisted she take a place among the guests, not hidden away but visible, equal. Grace felt the weight of every glance, some pitying, some hostile, but she kept her chin high, her hands steady. She wasn't here to beg for acceptance, she was here because Emily believed she deserved it. Nathan stood at the altar, his tie slightly askew, his eyes darting between Emily and the crowd. He'd agreed to let Grace stay, but the decision sat like a stone in his chest. He could feel his mother's disapproval from the front row, her lips pressed into a thin line. Clara had spent the last hour whispering to relatives, her words laced with warnings about standards and reputation. Nathan wanted to believe he was above it all, but the truth gnawed at him. He cared what people thought. He cared too much. Emily, radiant in her gown, moved through the church with a quiet determination. She'd spent the morning deflecting questions, soothing her bridesmaids, and ignoring the pointed looks from Nathan's family. Her heart raced, not with bridal nerves but with the weight of what she'd set in motion. Inviting Grace wasn't just about kindness, it was a stand against everything Willow Creek took for granted. She caught Grace's eye across the room and offered a small, encouraging smile. Grace nodded back, a flicker of gratitude in her gaze. As the organ began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony, a hush fell over the church. But the peace was short-lived. Clara stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the music. "This has gone far enough," she declared, turning to face the congregation. "I won't sit here and watch this mockery of a wedding. Emily, you've made your point, but this," she gestured toward Grace, "this is too much." The room froze. Emily's face flushed, but before she could respond, Grace rose from her seat. The crowd turned, their eyes wide, as if expecting her to shrink or flee. Instead, Grace spoke, her voice clear and unyielding. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's day," she said. "I'm here because someone saw me when no one else did. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Clara opened her mouth to retort, but no sound came. For the first time, she seemed small, her authority unraveling under the weight of Grace's truth. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my wedding, and Grace is my guest. If anyone can't accept that, they're free to leave." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in quiet support. Nathan's uncle, a gruff man known for his bluntness, stood and walked out, his wife trailing behind. A few others followed, their footsteps echoing in the tense silence. But most stayed, their faces a mix of conflict and curiosity. The line had been drawn, and Willow Creek was being forced to choose a side. The ceremony began, halting and strained. Emily and Nathan exchanged vows, their voices soft but heavy with unspoken questions. Grace watched from the back, her heart a tangle of pride and pain. She'd never expected to be here, in a church filled with people who'd spent years ignoring her. Yet here she was, not just a spectator but a catalyst, forcing the town to confront its own heart. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the tension seemed to ease, replaced by a fragile hope. But the real turning point came at the reception, held in a tent on the church lawn. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and barbecue, the tables adorned with white linens and mason jars filled with wildflowers. Grace had planned to slip away, to let the day belong to Emily and Nathan. But Emily found her before she could leave, pulling her toward the head table. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her eyes bright with defiance. "You're part of this." Nathan, still wrestling with his own unease, said nothing as Grace took a seat. The guests watched, some with warmth, others with barely concealed disdain. The meal passed in a blur of clinking glasses and forced small talk, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Then, as the band struck up a slow song, Emily stood, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I'd like to say something," she announced, holding a microphone with trembling hands. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on her. "Today isn't just about me and Nathan," she began. "It's about what love really means. Not just love between two people, but love for everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. I invited Grace here because I believe in that love. And I believe in this town, even when it's hard to see the good in it." She turned to Grace, her voice breaking. "Grace, you've shown me what strength looks like. You've faced more than most of us can imagine, and you're still here, still standing. I'm honored to have you with us today." The tent was silent, the weight of her words settling over the guests. Grace felt her throat tighten, unused to being seen, let alone celebrated. She stood, her hands shaking as she took the microphone from Emily. "I don't have much," she said, her voice rough but steady. "But I've got my story. And if you'll listen, I'd like to share it." What followed was a moment no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. Grace spoke of her life, her childhood in a segregated neighborhood, her dreams of becoming a nurse, the cascade of losses that left her on the streets. She spoke of the cruelty she'd endured, the kindness she'd craved, and the hope she'd clung to despite it all. But she didn't stop there. She turned to the crowd, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "You've all got stories too," she said. "And you've got choices. You can keep building walls, or you can start tearing them down. I'm here because someone chose the second." Her words were a spark, igniting something in the room. A woman in the back, a teacher who'd stayed silent through years of town gossip, stood and began to clap. Slowly, others joined her, the sound growing into a wave. Not everyone clapped. Clara sat stone-faced, and a few others looked away, but the applause was loud enough to drown out the dissent. Emily hugged Grace, tears streaming down her face, and Nathan, for the first time, met Grace's eyes with something like respect. The reception continued, but it was different now. People approached Grace, some offering apologies, others sharing their own stories of struggle. A young man, barely out of high school, handed her a plate of food, his shy smile a small act of courage. An older woman, whose husband had walked out earlier, squeezed Grace's hand and whispered, "You made me think." It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the end of Willow Creek's divisions, but it was a start. As the night wore on, Nathan found Grace by the edge of the tent, the stars bright above them. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low. "I didn't understand. I'm still learning, but thank you for staying." Grace studied him, seeing the struggle in his eyes. "Learning's the hard part," she said. "But it's the only part that matters." The wedding ended with dancing and laughter, but its impact lingered. Grace didn't stay in Willow Creek. She moved on, carrying Emily's invitation as a reminder of what was possible. But the town was never the same. Emily and Nathan, tested by that day, grew into a couple who challenged their community to be better. They started a small outreach program, using their home as a hub for meals and support for those in need. Grace's story became a quiet legend, a reminder that one act of courage could ripple outward, changing hearts and minds. Years later, people still talked about the wedding, about the homeless woman who'd stood tall and spoken truth. They debated what it meant. Was Emily's invitation naive or revolutionary? Was Grace a hero or a disruption? The questions lingered, forcing Willow Creek to grapple with its own soul. What do you think? Where does justice lie when kindness clashes with tradition? Share your thoughts, because in the end, it's our choices that shape the world.